How does a democracy die? Most people assume that dictators seize power overnight, but history suggests something quite different. Democracies collapse gradually through small decisions that seem reasonable at the time. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Benjamin Carter Hett, a historian at Hunter College and an expert on Nazi Germany, the rise of Hitler, and the collapse of democratic institutions in the 20th century. In today's conversation, we'll explain how Hitler rose to power, why ordinary people supported authoritarian governments, and what the fall of the Weimar Republic reveals about the challenges democracies face today. Professor Hett, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jay. I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, to start off, what first drew you to studying Nazi Germany and the collapse of the Weimar Republic?
That's funny. Part of the answer is I just never planned my career very well. I set out to be a lawyer, and I didn't like being a lawyer very much, so I decided I'd go back to school and study history and be a history professor. And I started off studying British history, and I took one class on Germany to fill up my schedule. And I decided, the thing about German history is that lots of things went wrong, and that made it to me kind of more interesting. So I switched over to studying Germany just because those things that went wrong seemed to me to be important. And very much in particular, the story of how the Weimar Republic went down the drain and became Nazi Germany in the late 20s and early 30s. That seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that that's a human story of really profound importance. That I think, the Nazis, what they were about, how they came to power, I think that tells us something important about what we are as human beings. And I think for people who live in a democracy, the fact that this very sophisticated democracy, which Weimar was, this very sophisticated culture, this country of highly educated people, that could end up in arguably the most brutal and murderous tyranny in history. That's not a happy lesson, but it's an important one. And to me, to understand how that could happen is a really important job. So basically, I've been fascinated by this for maybe 30 years now, and I'm still fascinated by it.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about Germany during this time period, most people my age and maybe older than me think that Hitler's rise to power was a sudden dramatic takeover. But from your perspective, after studying this for years, what does that narrative miss?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because that's the way Hitler wanted it to look. Hitler and his people, the word that they used for their coming to power was the seizure of power. And sometimes historians use that term, echoing it, but I think they shouldn't, because your question's right on point, that it actually wasn't sudden. Hitler wanted it to look like he and his followers had basically violently seized power in a coup d'etat because they thought that looked, kind of cooler and more macho and more fascist than, coming to power kind of in the boring way of elections and so on. But in fact, they came to power the boring way, basically with two elements here. Over a number of years, especially from the late 20s up to 33, they did better and better at putting out an appeal that large numbers of voters responded to, although never a majority. I think it's important to note the best the Nazis ever did in a free election was about a third of the vote, but that made them the biggest party, so that was political success. And they worked on crafting a message that would get them there. And then the other part is they basically spent years sort of trying to figure out how to get powerful men who were the gatekeepers of power to let them into power, because the way things worked in Germany in those days, there was a president of the republic, and the president had to ask somebody to form an administration, form a cabinet. And so the Nazis had to get the president, they had to convince him to do that, to open the doors to power for them. And the president, he was Paul von Hindenburg, World War I general. He had a clique of guys around him who were basically senior military commanders and big business leaders. And so these very elite guys needed to be persuaded that the Nazis would be good for their agenda. And so Hitler spent years sort of trying to do that. And that's basically the story. It's finding a way to win over voters, and it's finding a way to win over the powerful elites who controlled power. And that took several years. And that's basically the process by which they came to power.
And I think that's interesting that you're talking about this process that takes several years and trying to have people on your side that have power. What were some of the warning signs that appeared in Germany before Hitler took power? Was this sway of voters, sway of the elite visible, or were there other tells as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. The sway of voters was pretty visible because you could see that election after election. So for instance, in 1928, there was a national parliamentary election in Germany at which the Nazis got just a bit over 2% of the vote. So they're nowhere in 1928. Suddenly in 1930, they jump way up to just a bit over 18% of the vote. And at that point, they're the second biggest party. And then 2 years later, in 1932, they've jumped up to a third of the vote. So you could see that happening quite clearly. The other part was a bit more hidden. The ways in which the Nazis are trying to kind of work to get these powerful guys, these business leaders, these military commanders, ultimately President von Hindenburg, to open the door for them. That's a little more hidden. That wouldn't count as a warning sign. The voters, I mean, that would for sure count as a warning sign. Although I think it's important to say that, I mean, it looks like a warning sign to us because we know how this story ends. If you were living in Germany at the time, it wouldn't necessarily look like that because you don't know how this story is going to end. And, one thing that I always find very sobering is that as late as December 1932, so a month before Hitler actually gets into power, knowledgeable political observers were all saying, oh, this Hitler guy, he's done. This Nazi party, they're done. They've failed. They haven't got power. They're going to decline now and fall apart. And that might actually have happened if those elite guys hadn't opened the door to Hitler in January 1933. So, the outcome is never fixed. I mean, in history happens because human beings make decisions to make things happen, and it's never inevitable. And sometimes what looks like a warning sign, it looks like a warning sign in retrospect with hindsight. It doesn't necessarily look like a warning sign at the time.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of what you said about Hitler crafting a message a few minutes ago. Why did so many ordinary Germans, even though it was still not a majority, it was 33%, but still, how did 33% of Germans voluntarily support Hitler and the Nazi movement?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about this. I think it's important to understand that it's not like Hitler campaigned saying, vote for me and I will murder millions of people, and vote for me and I'll give you a world war. They didn't say that at all. It was pretty clear that they were anti-Semitic, and it was pretty clear that, not great things would happen to Jews if the Nazis were in power. But genocide was a concept that wasn't in anybody's mind in 1930 or 1932. The word didn't exist. I think that's important. The word didn't exist until 1943 even. So what did they say? This was sort of the theme of the book I wrote, The Death of Democracy, on this. And what I argue in the book is really the Nazis succeeded in the sense of getting a lot of votes by 1932 because they very successfully positioned themselves as the party that was an effective nationalist defense of Germans against globalization. And, in 1932, no one used the word globalization. But if you look at what the Nazis were actually talking about in election campaigns, that's what they're talking about. And, from our perspective now, I think it's really interesting. They're talking about trade and tariffs. They're talking about German businesses and German farmers getting killed by imports coming across the border. And, Hitler wanted bigger tariffs. They talk about migrant flows. The politics of the border was a very big deal. Germany had a new border in the 1920s in its east with Poland, and they did not have the police or military manpower to control that border. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of refugees coming across it, mostly fleeing violence in Russia from the Russian Revolution and the Civil War and other things like that. So like the politics of the border is something that, sets off an echo or two, I think, if you're an American in 2026. And super interestingly, Hitler talked a bit about companies outsourcing jobs. There's an amazing passage in a book that he wrote in 1928. He didn't publish it at the time, but he wrote it and stuck it in a drawer, and it was found after World War II. And in this 1928 book, he talked about German companies outsourcing jobs to China. And he says, Europeans might laugh about this now, but it's going to become a big deal. And this will really hurt Europeans in the future.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of wild that he saw that at the time. And, basically, again, if you sort of boil down the messages that the Nazis were putting out and the kind of voter with whom that message was resonating, and we have pretty good data on what kind of person voted for the Nazis in free elections, you sort of connect those two things, and what you see is it's that kind of anti-globalization appeal. The world is hurting us. We need a government that's tough enough to stick up for Germans. That's the message that really, got them votes.
Yeah, and I think those words that you're saying, nationalism, trade, migrants, I mean, if you're looking at Germany during that time period in the aftermath of World War One and the impacts of the Treaty of Versailles on Germany then, and then plus the Great Depression that spread through all of Europe, how
Yep.
important were fear and economic instability in shaping the political decisions during this period?
Yeah, it's a great question. Economic instability, massive, because of course, the Nazis rise to power in the context of the Great Depression of starting from 1929, which by any statistical way we can measure this, hit Germany harder than any other country in the world. The United States basically second, but Germany, if you look at things like how much does manufacturing decline, how much do exports decline, what's unemployment, Germany is just getting killed by the Great Depression. By 1932, the official unemployment rate was 40%, 40. Most historians think that probably undercounts. So, you get some idea of the economic devastation that is framing a lot of this politics. Um, Fear is a slightly more complicated issue. Basically, fear becomes, I would say, a big issue once Hitler's in power and once what the Nazis are doing is consolidating the rule of a dictatorship rather than trying to convince people to vote for them. And fear becomes a big issue in 1933 when they're in, and they start setting up concentration camps where they send their political opponents and, beat them. And they have their stormtroopers roaming in the streets, attacking people who might be or are opponents of them. The fear then becomes an issue there. It's not really much of an issue when the Nazis are at the point where they're still rising to power and trying to convince people to vote for them.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I've learned about your work is that it talks about how political polarization weakens these democratic institutions and systems, which is super relevant to our lives today, whether you're in one political party or the other. Now, how did
Yeah,
political divisions help create the conditions that allowed Hitler to rise?
yeah, that's a really important part of this whole thing, and it's actually super complicated in Germany in that time because you have to imagine. I mean, we're used to polarization in the sense of Democrats versus Republicans, right? But the Weimar Republic had somewhere in the ballpark of 30 political parties that won seats in the national parliament. They weren't all that important. Most of those were fringe parties, but there were about 8 parties that really mattered, that had a fairly substantial chunk of votes and that they mattered in the parliament. So picture, our, partisan division, but picture it sort of multiplied by, I guess, 4, right? Picture like 8 parties instead of 2.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a gulf of mistrust and even hatred sort of between each of those 8 parties and every other one of those 8 parties. So it's really complicated. And there's another element here too, I think, and that is that there is a cultural element for Germany. I think Germans, even today, and certainly back then, are people who, generally speaking, in comparison to Americans, are a lot more sort of driven by theory and principle. And they think a lot more about, is this right what I'm doing, or is this not right? And, there's a sort of cultural thing on that. And reinforced, I think, by the fact that certainly in, say, 1930, most Germans were Lutherans. That's sort of theoretically still true today, although most of them I don't think are very observant, but culturally that's where they're coming from. And the point of that is Lutheranism puts a lot of emphasis on, examining your conscience and doing the right thing. And, so Germans then and now, I think, are quite into examining their conscience and doing the right thing. What this meant for politics, because, democratic politics, you have maybe heard that saying, if you like sausage, you don't want to see how it's made, right? Like, and
Yeah.
democratic politics involves necessarily making compromises that, you're not going to want to make. Democratic politics really won't work without that. And for Germans, there's a really stiff cultural resistance to doing that. So, for instance, I wrote about this a bit in my book that, trying to sort of make deals happen in Weimar Germany. There was one instance, for instance, when one of the far right-wing parties agreed to make a deal with one of the centrist democratic parties, which meant sort of giving up something that was quite important to them. And a leader of one of these democratic parties, instead of kind of celebrating this and saying, good for you. Thank you for making this deal. This is making democracy work. We appreciate your flexibility. Instead of saying that, what he said was, I feel sorry for people who voted for you and get this betrayal. Like, he's actually accusing the guy who's just made a deal that benefits him. He's accusing the other guy of betraying his principles because, again, it's kind of a German mindset, at the risk of being a bit stereotypical. It's kind of a German mindset to put principle quite high and, to sort of think, well, but it's really sleazy in politics to make a deal that compromises your principles. So again, think about this in the context of 8 parties that all hate each other, basically. And those 8 political parties also came from very kind of clear, well-defined demographic groups. Like, there was not much mystery to who you would vote for if you lived in the Weimar Republic. If you're a certain kind of person, it would be clear who you're going to vote for. If you're a Catholic, there was a party just for Catholics. Actually, there were 2 parties just for Catholics, but you're going to vote for one or the other. If you are a skilled worker and you belong to a union, there's one party you're going to vote for, and that's it. You're probably not going to vote for anybody else. If you're an unemployed worker, there's a party you're going to vote for, and probably not anybody else. If you are a middle-class business person, there's about 2 or 3 parties. You're going to vote for one of those, and they're sort of broadly similar. So there's, the sort of divisions between the parties was also reinforced by the fact that they reflected real divisions in the society between people who didn't necessarily like each other very much.
Now, when we're talking about these 8 parties, does this, like, while this also increases tensions, obviously, does this ever make compromise easier because you have more parties with some, like you're saying, like 3 workers' parties with maybe some similar overlap? Or is there still quite a lot of conflict there?
No, I don't think it ever made anything easier. It basically made everything harder. And it's also complicated by the way a parliamentary system works. And this is not always so familiar to Americans, but I think most democracies in the world, Britain, Germany, Canada, where I grew up, have parliamentary systems. And one of the things that means is you basically always have to have a majority of some kind in the national parliament, and that's what kind of supports what we would call the executive branch. And the thing is, to get to a majority in the parliament of the Weimar Republic, or the Reichstag as it was called, was really challenging because, again, coming back to those 8 major parties, each of them has a sliver of the vote. But, most of the time, until the Nazis started to really win in 1932, the biggest party was the left of center Social Democratic Party. They generally had around 25, 28% of the vote.
Sure.
And then it sort of goes down from there. You've got parties that are still fairly significant parties, but they have 7 or 8% of the vote. And somehow you need to put together a coalition to back a cabinet that has 50% plus 1. And again, these parties all hate each other. So, it was always very difficult to do that. No coalition lasted very long. One of the things I like to do when I'm doing classes on this, I put a slide up for my students, which lists the administrations of the Weimar Republic. And between 1918 and 1933, a little bit depending on how you want to define the first and the last, but there were basically 21 different administrations.
Wow.
And I should remember, but I don't, like maybe 8 or 10 different human beings were chancellor, something like that. They just kept turning over and turning over and turning over. The sort of longest lasted about 2 years. Some administrations lasted just weeks or months. I mean, it's really hard to keep a stable government going.
Yeah. And more than that, when discussing authoritarian movements, I feel like we often tend to focus on the leaders, like those different chancellors. But what role did ordinary citizens play in either protecting or weakening the democratic institutions at the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think I would say they played a big role on both sides of it because German politics in that era was marked by quite high levels of public engagement and participation. For instance, election turnouts were quite high, very high by American standards these days. You would get, usually 80–85% or so of eligible voters coming out to vote in elections, which, by any comparative standard is quite high. Lots of people belonged to political parties. Lots of people were activists in political parties. Over time, the Nazis got to be very good at attracting people who were activists. They became the largest party in terms of membership. And they had, and actually every party in Weimar actually had literally a gang of thugs. They had paramilitary groups whose job basically, I mean, the politics was sort of nuts. The job of these paramilitary groups was to go out and basically fight gang warfare with the paramilitary groups from all the other parties. And, you know, the Nazis paramilitary is kind of famous. They're known as the stormtroopers or the brown shirts, same thing. Um, but what's less well known is every other party, including the kind of nice centrist democratic parties, they had their gangs of thugs too that would go out and fight with the brown shirts. And, you know, to give you an idea of the scale of this, by the time Hitler comes to power in 1933, there were about 3 million men in the Nazi brown shirts. And this is in a country which had a population at the time of about 65 million.
Oh, wow.
So if you picture this in an American context, imagine if there was a paramilitary force linked with one of our parties that had, you know, 20 million or so, mostly young men in it, right? And their job is to like go out into the streets and find people who disagree with them and beat them up. And that's basically their job. So imagine what our cities would look like if that was the deal, right? It's so, I mean, in a way, I mean, it's not helping democracy any, but it does speak to that level of involvement of a lot of regular people. The guys in the stormtroopers were super regular guys, mostly young men who didn't have a job. And kind of the same with the other parties. I mean, like I said, the Social Democrats actually had two different groups like this. They had a kind of relatively moderate one called the Reich Banner, and then they had a tougher, more violent one called the Iron Front. The kind of right-wing but not Nazi German National Party had a couple of groups similar, you know, sort of gangs of thugs. The Communists had two groups, again, gangs of thugs whose main job was to get into gang warfare with Nazis, basically. So it's a kind of remarkable political scene in that respect.
Yeah. And I mean that's kind of shocking to me. Like I I think the comparison where you scale it up to America and you see like 20 million young Americans in these paramilitary organizations, it's making me wonder, what do you think most students misunderstand about how democracies fail? Is it the
Mm.
scope of how entrenched they are into our systems, or yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure I know the answer. You maybe have a better idea than I do, but I'll hazard a guess, just based on what I see, you know, from the students I work with. I think most students overestimate the impact of propaganda. Um,
Sure.
Among other things, I mean, I have so many students who do courses with me and they want to write term papers on Nazi propaganda. I think this is something that a lot of people find interesting. And, you know, I'm not complaining or criticizing that, but I do think propaganda is not going to make you do anything you're not already going to do. I think it's not going to make you, probably, it's not going to make you believe anything you don't already believe. Um, the propaganda, you know, and often students will write something, or scholars, I think, maybe should know better, often write, oh, this propaganda just convinced all Germans that Hitler was a god and the Nazis had all the answers. And if that were true, then the Nazis would have done a lot better than a third of the vote in national elections. I mean, the propaganda worked on a certain segment of Germans who were already kind of predisposed probably to go with that message. So I think that the overestimation of propaganda maybe is the biggest misconception that students have, when in fact I think a lot of the story of what happened in Weimar is that people voted for things that they thought were good for them. It's just they weren't. You know, kind of coming back to what I was saying about, you know, the Nazi appeal against globalization. A lot of people thought, oh yeah, they'll stick up for me, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, spoiler alert, they didn't. The Nazis didn't stick up for the people that they promised a better deal. Um, but you know, I think we need to remember that whether it's 1930 or 2026, people vote in elections for all kinds of reasons, but usually front and center in most voters most of the time is an idea of how their economic self-interest is going and what politician might help them. And then, of course, there's the element of low information. People don't always understand actually accurately what's going on and who might be the best politician to solve their problems. So, I mean, that's the other thing, I guess.
Yeah. And if you had to give one final takeaway to younger audiences about political power, what would it be?
I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of that. Can you repeat the question?
If you had to give one final takeaway to younger audiences about political power and democracies, what would it be?
Hmm. I think I might say two things. First thing is this doesn't happen without you. I think a lot of young people are kind of cynical about politics. Maybe they don't think it has anything to do with them, or maybe they think there's nothing they can do about it. And I think that's wrong. And it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy. Politicians are going to make decisions about you, and decisions that affect you. Student loans, tuition, I mean, all kinds of stuff, healthcare, right? Stuff that may be important for you. And if you don't get involved, those decisions will be made in ways that probably aren't helpful to you. If you do get involved, you've got a better chance of better outcomes. And I think often people, all kinds of people, but including young people, underestimate how much impact they can have. I've talked to a lot of people, like Congress people, or people who work in congressional offices, that kind of thing, and they've all said very strongly, Congress people take very seriously calls to their office because they assume where there's one call about an issue, there's probably a few hundred people who are thinking the same thing, at least. So call your Congress people, call your senators. If there's something that you think is bad or needs to change, make phone calls. And if you got a little more time, I always really urge young people, get involved, like volunteer for something that you believe in, whatever that may be. Get involved in an organization, and you can make change happen. You absolutely can make change happen. And it doesn't happen without you, or better said, it will happen without you, but then it'll happen in a way that you don't like. So that's one thing I would say. And just the other thing I would say, I feel a lesson that I have learned from my research over many years is that if you don't want to be living in an authoritarian political system, the thing you need to do is think about building really big alliances. What you call in politics a big tent or a big coalition. That means, going back to my first answer, get involved in politics, but then also get involved in a way that you sort of think about what's the most important issue and who can I work with, to make the things happen that I want to happen. And I'll give you a concrete example. In the 2024 election, I was involved with a group called Democracy First, which was a nonpartisan group, which basically got together a group of people like me, like basically history professors and political science professors and journalists and other people who are kind of engaged with issues of democracy and authoritarianism, and sets us out to do events in swing states and talk to voters about, the danger of authoritarianism and the importance of democracy. Non-partisan or bipartisan or multi-partisan, I'm not sure if quite the correct word, but we had Democrats, we had Republicans, we had independents all working together. There were people who were sort of like AOC or Bernie style, like Democratic Socialists, and there was Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney was involved in this thing too. So you got like the right, you've got the left. But the point is, what everybody agreed on was that authoritarianism is bad, and if there's an authoritarian threat, you need to mobilize everybody who will say, the first thing is saving democracy, let's save that. And then we can worry about other things. And, if I could ever have a conversation with Liz Cheney, I'm a fairly liberal guy politically. If I were ever to sit down and talk to Liz Cheney, I would say, I'm super happy to work with you right now. When, democracy is safe and there's no authoritarians around, we can go back to disagreeing and that'll be cool. And we'll know we've won because we can disagree again. But right now, we need to work together.